Hi, my name is Layton. I'm an intuitive and a mystic, and this video is part 2 of a series that I am doing on the nervous system of the narcissist. So, I'm going to give the same disclaimer that I gave in part 1, which is that I am not referring to the narcissist in this series as someone who has no empathy or is sociopathic or psychopathic. Instead, I am referring to specifically individuals that have experienced so much trauma that they have developed narcissistic traits. Now, to the untrained eye, this can look exactly the same. Someone who doesn't know the difference between narcissistic tendencies due to trauma or someone who is actually a sociopath is really not going to be able to tell the difference. And I'm hoping that this video will shed some light on that. But also, I just want to say that, and I gave this disclaimer in the last video too, if there's someone in your life, whether or not you know if their tendencies are from trauma and CPTSD or because they are genuinely sociopathic, if they are harming you in any way, if they are disrespecting you, if they are abusing you, you do not owe them anything. You do not have to feel guilty for cutting off contact with them if that's what it takes. You don't have to feel guilty for moving on with your life, even if you know that these tendencies that they have do stem from trauma. You don't have to stick around while they work that out, especially if they aren't even trying. If they are so detached from themselves that they refuse to acknowledge that they have these tendencies, it's just not going to be healthy to stick around for that. So that brings me to kind of where I left off in the last video. We were talking a lot about what kind of childhood does it take to create this kind of person? What kind of childhood does it take to trigger the nervous system enough, to program the nervous system enough that these tendencies develop? Then we were talking about what traits or tendencies can look like in someone struggling with narcissistic tendencies. So I just want to go ahead and say that most of the time, someone who is struggling with narcissistic tendencies due to PTSD or CPTSD has no idea that they are. They may feel as though they are very self-aware. And I know this was certainly the case for me. While I definitely was not a full narcissist by any means, I had some narcissistic traits. I was very defensive, very passive-aggressive. I had a really hard time accepting criticism because I felt so bad about myself all the time. I was so deeply insecure that if anyone else brought any of my flaws to my attention, it was almost traumatizing for me. Or should I say re-traumatizing for me, because it reminded me of a childhood where I felt criticized 24/7. So despite the fact that I am naturally a very self-aware person, I was not self-aware in this sense. I thought that I was, and I'm going to explain why. I thought that I was self-aware about the way that I was because I was so deeply aware of what I was feeling. I was so deeply aware of what I was thinking. And a point that I really need to get across is that in someone who has these narcissistic tendencies, specifically due to trauma, they are not going to be operating out of logic. And this is because with chronic dysregulation of the nervous system, which is, that's a given if you have childhood trauma, you're probably going to be chronically dysregulated, whether you are activated all the time or shut down. The prefrontal cortex quite literally shuts down. When this happens, we don't have access to logic. We can't see the bigger picture. We can't process things from a realistic or mature standpoint. So how are we processing them then? If we don't have access to logic because we are, like I said, the prefrontal cortex is shut down, this means we are operating out of our reptilian brain. We are operating out of survival. So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with emotional reasoning. And emotional reasoning is a cognitive distortion. Some other cognitive distortions would be black and white thinking. That's a really big one. But emotional reasoning is a very common one, and that is when we use our emotions to make sense of our actions. So we say something like, I feel this way, so this must be true. Or this is how I feel, and there's no information that we can be presented with that can really make us feel otherwise, because we are really operating out of this place where, like I said, we are unable to access true logic, and we don't even know the difference. We are often so used to using emotional reasoning that if anyone were to bring up to us that we are not acting out of logic or that we're not being reasonable, that would be very offensive to us. To us, it would be like saying, your feelings aren't valid, your experience is not real, or even you're delusional, you're crazy. Because to us, it feels like our trauma is our reality. It feels like our perception of things, which again are stemming from a wound, is our reality. And this is because we have been identifying with a wound for so long. We have been identifying with our pain and trauma for so long that we don't even have an identity separate from it. And this is unfortunately why so many people don't develop awareness of their behaviors. Because in childhood, the psyche becomes so fragmented, and due to trauma, they become so dissociated from who they really are, and they end up with just kind of all these different fragments of pain. They may end up with all of these different coping mechanisms that are literally just a survival response, and they're taking on that survival response and believing that it's a personality, and it's not. They have not learned healthy attachment. They have not learned how to feel safe within their nervous system. They have not learned self-regulation. They haven't learned co-regulation. They don't have their own opinions because their opinions are based on trauma. And that's where we also see a lot of prejudice and things like that stem from, because opinions are formed in a sense that feels very valid to them, but they aren't formed along with logic. Again, it's that emotional reasoning. So because the narcissist is always in fight or flight, they are quite literally only operating out of this reptilian part of their brain, and that makes having any sort of conversation or argument with them very, very frustrating. You probably feel gaslit. You will probably feel like you are going crazy. And honestly, if you are a person that has experienced a lot of trauma, you may have been on the other end of this. I know I had instances where I felt confused and I was the one doing the emotional reasoning, and I genuinely believed that the other person was gaslighting me because my emotional experience was so overpowering that it was almost impossible for me to see past that. And the way that we can kind of bridge that gap, the way that we begin to heal that, is through nervous system regulation. For me, that changed absolutely everything. When I learned that, okay, I don't have to be ruled by my emotions. I don't have to be ruled by my ups and downs. And it's not this mental thing. You can't just turn it off. You can't just say, I don't know why I'm acting like this. Why am I so moody all the time? Why am I so reactive? You know what? I should stop. It doesn't work that way. And people that try and say that it works that way, they really don't have a proper understanding of the nervous system. They don't have an understanding of PTSD. They're not trauma informed, because we only have brain access according to body access. So unless we are developing safety within the body, unless we are connecting to the sensations within our body, unless we are acknowledging what we are feeling in our body when certain emotions arise and where we are feeling it, and coming out of that dissociated state and into a more embodied state, we won't even realize that we were dissociated to begin with, because how could we? That was our permanent state before. So I have some notes here that I'm going to be referring to from time to time, because I really don't want to miss anything. I think that this is incredibly important to talk about, because I think that it is something that so many people deal with and we feel so much shame about. I know I did. I used to feel so much shame because I didn't understand why I was being so defensive with people that I loved, why I was being so passive aggressive, why I couldn't accept criticism. And I didn't feel like I was living in a way that was aligned with my values, no matter how hard I tried to. And that's because we genuinely cannot be our best self. We cannot show up as our best self when we are operating from a wound, because the wound is not who we are. So when we identify with our trauma, yeah, of course that's not going to be pretty. Of course that's not going to look good. And what we need to stop doing is having this collective black and white thinking where we say things like, this is how good people behave. This is how bad people behave. And everyone falls into one of those two categories. That is not realistic. It's not. It's not true. Because we have so many traits, we are so broad. And when we are traumatized and when we are acting out of pain, if you've ever heard that saying, hurting people hurt people, I think that saying can be problematic if we apply it to too much. But if we simplify it and just say, you know what, sometimes people are hurting inside and they may not even be trying to hurt other people, but it kind of happens because they can't live as their best self when they're in that survival mode. But what we really want to make sure to do is also have boundaries with those people and understand that just because someone is hurting doesn't mean that their actions are okay. Just because someone is hurting or traumatized doesn't mean that we should accept abuse. We never should. And if we are the ones that are hurting and we are the ones that are traumatized, we don't get to say, well, I have this excuse because I was traumatized. So that's why I'm hurting you. That's why I'm doing this. No. We have to take responsibility for ourselves. Maybe we weren't responsible for what happened to us. We weren't responsible for the harm that was done to us. We weren't responsible for what initially traumatized us, but we are responsible for how we choose to respond to that trauma. We are responsible for how we choose to move on and to move forward in life, and how we choose to react to other people. So I definitely want to make sure that I emphasize that, because this video is not to make excuses for anyone. But at the same time, we have way too much shame around our trauma. We have way too much shame around the ways that we acted when we weren't our best selves. And every single person has times where they aren't the most loving, they aren't the most gentle, they aren't the most forgiving. And so often, those times are correlated with a phase of being very dysregulated within the nervous system. So going back to what I was initially saying about people struggling with narcissistic tendencies not having self-awareness, this is where we see a lot of what I am going to call baiting or fishing, because they don't know how to self-regulate. And this, we definitely see this especially in people that have grown up in a household that was very volatile, that was very chaotic, or that was very disorganized. The attachment was very disorganized. So maybe they felt ignored by their parents unless there was some like family drama. or unless they did something wrong. And then there's this huge emotional explosion from the parent onto the child. And it's intimacy. It's intimacy. It's not good intimacy, but it might be the only time that the child even feels close to the parent. And so what ends up happening is that an adult who feels detached in their relationship, who feels like their partner isn't paying enough attention to them, this doesn't have to be a real thing. It can be a perceived feeling. Their partner may have no idea that they even feel that way, because maybe they struggle to even communicate that they feel that way. But what happens is that when they feel that way, they may start to be very judgmental and critical onto the partner to get a reaction from the partner. And then as soon as they get that reaction, suddenly they seem to have this mood flip where suddenly everything's fine. And that's because their partner reacting in such an emotional way met that need for intimacy. And in people that have all of this unhealed trauma, especially if they have never been in a healthy relationship sense and they have never experienced true co-regulation and or just a safe person, they are going to think that is what love looks like, and that's what intimacy looks like. And that is especially where we see these mutually volatile relationships where there's this constant fighting. It's like if you're not making love, you're making war. And it's all of this constant buildup of nervous system dysregulation. But the thing is that people get addicted to that. They get addicted to it because it mirrors the chaos that they grew up in. So the narcissist, or someone experiencing narcissistic tendencies, I should say, can only then feel this illusion of co-regulation through anything that triggers this massive emotional release. And that triggers all kinds of brain chemicals too. I could do a whole other video on the biochemistry behind that. So because they can't control their own emotions, they then seek to control their partner, or they seek to control their child, because they want to control whoever is in their immediate environment because they can't control themselves. If you grew up with a controlling parent where you felt like you walked in the room and your presence just showed up wrong, it's like you walked in the room wrong and suddenly they're, upset with you about something, or giving you the silent treatment, or yelling at you about something. Or you could be doing something super innocent, like, I don't know, coloring a picture, but you're doing it next to a parent that is working on their computer, and you doing that is distracting to them. And instead of just lovingly relocating you, they project their own lack of emotional control, their own dysregulation onto you as if you're doing something wrong. This is something that I feel like is very common. I feel like a lot of people grew up this way, where they weren't doing anything wrong, but they were made to feel as though they were. They were scapegoated, and it's like they could never do anything right because they were always in the wrong place, because the person experiencing these tendencies, they feel uncomfortable, anxious, sad. It doesn't matter what it is. And if you are in that space and they don't know how to self-regulate, projecting that onto you means that they don't have to own it. They can say that these things that I don't know how to handle, they're not mine, they're yours. And you need to fix this so I can feel better. And it's supposed to be the other way around, especially with parents. The parent is supposed to be regulating the child. But in someone with narcissistic tendencies, we see that the way that they grew up was most likely that the parent either said, this is too much for me, that's a you problem, and you need to deal with this on your own. Or the parent said, you being upset has upset me, and you need to get it together so that I can feel better. And that is simply not okay. So we can see how these experiences in childhood drastically impact the nervous system. And then we have adults walking around that don't know what nervous system dysregulation is. They don't know what somatic experiencing is. They don't know what dissociation is. They don't know how to locate feelings in their body. They don't know what co-regulation is. They don't know what a healthy relationship looks like. And they aren't trying, usually, to hurt anyone, but they end up hurting lots of people, and they end up hurting themselves. And it's important that we talk about this because it's common. I mean, do you know anyone walking around that has no trauma? Most people have at least something. Most people have at least something, and we don't learn this stuff in school. We're not, sitting in high school learning how to self-regulate, or what co-regulation looks like, or what a healthy relationship looks like. So what ends up happening is that we end up only experiencing ourselves through other people's reactions and other people's responses. And that is what we call mirroring. And that is what happens when someone mirrors something back to us that is uncomfortable or painful, and we get triggered. And along with learning how to regulate ourselves, we also need to learn what our triggers are. We need to learn how to respond to triggers instead of reacting. We need to learn what healthy communication looks like, and what healthy self-regulation looks like, what healthy co-regulation looks like. So I'm probably going to talk a lot more about that in future videos, but for the sake of this video, I wanted to just keep it on kind of what happens in the nervous system, what is happening in the brain that creates this nervous system condition. But I really wanted to simplify it so that it's easy to understand and that it's relatable in some way. And this is why people end up in these very controlling relationships. People end up in these very manipulative relationships, because this manipulation, these controlling behaviors, they are literally a bid for survival. And again, I am not talking about people who are sociopathic or psychopathic or have no empathy and are just doing stuff to mess with you. In fact, anyone watching this, I would welcome you to watch this video through the lens of yourself and not through the lens of scanning everybody else to see if they have narcissistic tendencies. It starts with us. We have to look at the self first. So I'm going to end that there. If you have any questions about this, I would love to hear it. And thank you so much for being here with me.